don't know anything about Maurice. I thought he'd have a long white beard. Oh, I really did. I'd say he'd be an old codger now and we'd have to be nice to him. And then I walk in and I see this fine young fellow here. And I don't know anything about him or about his speech or about what he's going to say. I don't. But Kathleen, who's on our committee, Kathleen McMahon, heard him speaking before. I think it was in Minute, and she told us it was brilliant. Now we'll judge that this time. All right.
So I was here in 2015 as an award winner, now back as a speaker. So it's a funny set of circumstances. So thanks very much to the Society for bringing me over this weekend. I'm really excited to present this research, which has been an emotional roller coaster, to say the least, and digging all this stuff up. And it's a real privilege to bring the story back home, so to speak. I want to begin with a rather striking fact, which is that during the 1920s, Liam O'Flaherty became the single most widely translated contemporary Irish author in the Soviet Union, more so than people like Sean O'Casey and Pat O'Donnell, who would initially seem more ideologically in tune with what the Soviets would have desired. Moreover, as Jenny pointed out to me, Russian was the first language into which O'Flaherty was translated outside of English. My talk today focuses partly on how O'Flaherty's works made it to the USSR, but chiefly I want to look at the unusual legacy of these writings that spans decades. There is a simple explanation for the popularity of O'Flaherty in elite Soviet cultural circles, and that is that O'Flaherty had a close friend in the upper echelons of the Soviet cultural elite. Perhaps even more remarkably, this friend was a hitherto unknown woman from Wexford who emigrated to Moscow in 1924. Her name was May O'Callaghan, and this talk will introduce her, and it will also introduce some other individuals who were crucially important in bringing O'Flaherty's work to Russian audiences. In particular, Nellie Cohen, a British communist activist whose life would be bound to O'Flaherty in a surprising and extremely intimate way, and her tragically fated sister, Rose Cohen. So all of this research began about this time last year when I became essentially obsessed with this reference in a 1934 memoir. There's a memoir penned by a man called Joseph Freeman, who's a now forgotten but once celebrated member of the American literary left. And in his 1934 memoir, An American Testament, which charts his move towards his epiphany of communist conviction, he writes about living in Moscow in 1928, and how in Moscow his boss was an Irish woman in her middle 40s, whom from her initials we called OB. For years she had moved in the radical literary and political circles of Dublin and London. Liam O'Flaherty was one of her friends and her favourite genius. Oh, he's a wild one, OB would tell me. Drunk as a lord and crazy for the women, but mark my word, he'll be the pride of English literature. And these words would be prophetic in more ways than one. I'm not the first person to discover this reference. Eamon O'Connor, who's really the eminent historian of labour in Ireland, wrote about this reference in his book, Reds and the Green. And he identified OB as Kathleen O'Brennan, who was the sister-in-law of Eamon Ceannt, executed after 1916. Try as I might, I looked at Kathleen O'Brennan's papers, and I could find no indication that she had ever stepped foot in Russia. So I began to toy with the idea that maybe there was another Irish woman living in Moscow at this time. This is a card from a set of documents which were scanned and sent to me by the University of Oregon, which basically certified the real identity of this woman. This is written in Russian, and it's addressed to Sergei Dynamov, who is a quite well-known young literary intellectual of the Moscow cultural scene. And essentially it says, "This is the preface for The Informer. Hope that everything's okay. Send the money with Nellie Cohen. Thank you for everything, OC." So when Freeman wrote in his memoir of OB, he was essentially using a code to hide the real identity of his friend who he knew as OC. So who was OC? May O'Callaghan, known to all of her friends as OC, lived really quite a frankly extraordinary life. She was born in Wexford Town in 1881, upper middle class family, father an RIC police inspector, And then she ends up being educated at the University of Vienna, where she studies modern languages. She teaches English and lectures on the Irish literary revival. And one of her students was Ludwig Boltzmann, who's seen as the father of atomic physics. She taught him English. She remained there in Vienna for more than a decade, and she left shortly before the outbreak of the Great War. So she was initially en route to the US, but when she arrived in London, basically the First World War started, and she couldn't get sea travel to the US. So she was remaining in London, she needed money. She answered an advert in a newspaper. A woman was seeking a sub-editor for her newspaper, and this woman was Sylvia Pankhurst, the famous suffragette. So May O'Callaghan took this job, and she became sub-editor of Sylvia Pankhurst's paper, The Workers' Dreadnought. And this, I think, is where May O'Callaghan may have first come into contact with Liam O'Flaherty, because Liam O'Flaherty, in his memoir Two Lives, talks about arriving in London in the early 1920s, and he goes to join his local Communist Party, and he picks up their newspaper broadsheet, and he names it The Workers' Dreadnought, which was being sub-edited by May O'Callaghan. O'Callaghan took up residence in Moscow in 1924. She was fluent in German, French, and Russian, and she quickly rose through the ranks of the press department of the Communist International. And this was sort of a bureaucratic, centralized body which oversaw and directed national communist parties around the world. So May O'Callaghan really had quite a prestigious position, and that's where she met Joseph Freeman, was the boss of Joseph Freeman. While living in the Soviet capital, she befriended some of the most important cultural figures in Russia's tumultuous 20th century, including the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, director Sergei Eisenstein, and theatrical practitioner Vsevolod Meyerhold. May O'Callaghan's closest friend and companion until her death in 1973 was Nellie Cohen. And to bring you back to the postcard, it's the woman in the postcard who O'Callaghan addresses as saying, bring the money with Nellie Cohen. Cohen was born in London in 1892. She's the daughter of Polish Jewish immigrants. She also joined Sylvia Pankhurst's East London Federation of Suffragettes and became Sylvia Pankhurst's personal secretary. And this is where she first met May O'Callaghan. Sylvia Pankhurst, if any of you know about her biography, she goes on this very unusual trajectory, and she's extremely inspired by the Russian Revolution, so much so that she no longer is agitating for the vote because she believes that parliaments are useless, ineffectual. Rather, she believes that a Soviet-style system should be established in Britain. And to that end, Sylvia Pankhurst founds the Communist Party, British section of the Third International, and this Communist Party is actually founded in the flat that Nellie Cohen shared with May O'Callaghan. During the 1920s, as the visa stamps on her passport attest, Nellie Cohen travelled to and from the Soviet Union, likely as a courier. And actually, the background that I used for the PowerPoint presentation is an excerpt, is one of her Soviet visas from her passport. And now the third individual, the person to whom that card I showed you was addressed to, was a man named Sergei Dynamov. He was born in Moscow in 1901. During the Russian Civil War, enlisted with the Red Army. In the late 1920s, becomes involved in a number of journals focused on foreign literature, and he's actually the person credited with introducing Western science fiction to the Soviet Union. He writes monographs on George Bernard Shaw and Theodore Dreiser, and is regularly corresponding with Western writers. You find him in archives all over the world, carrying out correspondence with authors that he admires. What's important for our story, he becomes head of the Anglo-American section of the Moscow-based state publishing house Gottesstadt, which was the publishing house that would publish O'Flaherty. He had met O'Callaghan through O'Callaghan's flat. O'Callaghan lived in the Hotel Lux, which was a hotel reserved for foreign workers working in the Communist International. And from accounts that you find some evidence that suggests that O'Callaghan's flat in Hotel Lux was sort of like a literary gathering point where Russian writers could meet the Western writers that they admired. So this trio really functioned as O'Flaherty's interlocutors in the Soviet Union. O'Callaghan introduced O'Flaherty's writing to her well-placed literary friends. People like Sergei Dynamov arranged for the translation and the publication of these books, and Nellie Cohen acted as a person essentially bringing the royalties, manuscripts back and forth between Moscow and London. Here's some of the productions of this collaborative relationship. On the left is, and I know we've at least 2 Cyrillic readers in the audience, and you'll see that the Russians always struggle to standardize Liam O'Flaherty's name. On the left, you'd pronounce that as Liam O'Flaherty, and on the right, you'd call it Liam O'Flaherty. So it's a pain for me, because if you're searching library catalogues, you basically have to invent new ways of spelling Liam O'Flaherty's name, and you'll eventually hit on something. The left is Brodyaga, which translates as wanderer. This may be a translation of Spring Sowing, but I'm actually more certain that what it is a book that exists only for the Soviet market, which is a collection of O'Flaherty's short stories, basically edited together and called Wanderer, and then put out in Russian. On the right is Palatka, which means the tent. So that's a short story collection, The Tent. On the left, published in Leningrad, and on the right, published in Moscow. Here's just a list of the ones I've been able to identify. These, I'm sure, and because there's references in some of the correspondence, I'm sure that there's also short stories published in Soviet journals, but the Soviet journals in the 1930s are quite hard to find in libraries outside of Russia, so I haven't been yet able to go through them in detail. So the Informer and Spring Sowing, or Brodyaga, are interesting because they're the only ones I can find edition numbers for. So the Informer was printed in 4,000 copies, and Spring Sowing was printed in 6,000. So between these 2 numbers, there would probably be a good estimate for how many editions of O'Flaherty were being published, which would suggest, in terms of cultural production of that time in the Soviet Union, that it was marketed at a very sort of elite section of Soviet literary reading public, so not mass market paperbacks, essentially. So what did O'Flaherty make of this arrangement? Some evidence can be found in his correspondence with Mayo Callahan, which recounts in characteristic bluster his inability to procure royalties for his work. Anyone who's read his memoirs will recognise the constant griping and complaining about being unable to get royalties. Dear OC, he writes, "For Christ's sake, try to get those bastards to send me some money. Otherwise, I'm coming over next February or March to blow up the Gossesdat premises and to abduct all the mistresses of the Commissars." There's a series of these letters. They're actually in A.A. Kelly's collected letters, so you can read them for yourselves, and he always adopts this tone. Sergei Dynamov did, for his part, try to rectify the situation. He noted in a letter to Joseph Freeman, one thing I really like about reading Sergei Dynamov's letters is that he wrote this in this very beautiful broken English. He writes, "Liam O'Flaherty will come to Moscow, maybe only next year. He has no money. Now I will try very much to receive for him 1,000 rubles for his rights in Soviet Russia." So that's a letter from about 1927. So here in the arrival of O'Flaherty's works on Russian soil were also the seeds of his own arrival to the Soviet Union and eventual publication of I Went to Russia. So you can see that through this relationship, they're trying to bring O'Flaherty over to write a book on Russia. O'Flaherty was often well received by Soviet editors, if not well paid. Dynamov informed O'Callaghan that O'Flaherty's short story, The Mountain Tavern, was well received by the editors of the journal which had printed it, which included Anatoly Lunacharsky, very well-known old Bolshevik, who was the head of the Commissariat for Enlightenment, essentially a Soviet version of a Ministry for Education. One of the earliest pieces of Soviet criticism of O'Flaherty was Dynamov's review of The Informer for the Soviet journal Print and Revolution. The review gave a general overview of Irish proletarian literature through a Soviet lens before quoting from Dynamov's correspondence with O'Flaherty to give a sense of the author's personality. So I quote, "Detesting capitalist society, he expressed sincere sympathy with our revolution, while at the same time internally contested. He left the party and the workers' movement perceiving it in a Dostoevsky-like manner. I do not know whether I am Alyosha or Ivan Karamazov." So that's a quote from O'Flaherty. O'Flaherty, Dynamov says, could not accept the social revolution while the Irish rebellion was being suppressed. Despite this neutral tone of Dynamov's biographical overview of O'Flaherty, the Soviet critic had little good to say of The Informer itself. He condemned O'Flaherty for ignoring the historical moment of proletarian revolution and forwarding an unfair assessment of Irish radicalism. But he did note at the end that all Russian literary readers should be obliged to read The Informer nonetheless. Shortly after this review was published, May O'Callaghan returned to Dublin for what must have been the first time in more than a decade. And she writes these two quite long letters from Dublin, in 1927 to Joseph Freeman, her literary friend in America. And they're really quite wonderful letters, and they're quite unique as historical documents, because this is a Wexford woman who's been living in this revolutionary society for years, and she comes back to this new society that's kind of fitfully being established in Ireland, and she's constantly comparing the two, and how the path of Russia has compared to that of Ireland. And perhaps counterintuitively, she perceives them as being almost like mirrors of each other. She says that when she walks the streets, she attends a Jim Larkin rally, because it's coming up to the 1927 election. She talks about there being that same symbiosis between cultural circles and revolutionary circles that she finds in Moscow. She does say that there's an awful amount of religion, and everyone seems to get very mixed up with it. But overall, it's an idea of synthesis. And her guide, of course, during this visit to Dublin is Liam O'Flaherty. She writes of O'Flaherty, "He is so very clever and unusual. If and when he comes to New York, I must get him to look you up. Of course, the very funny thing is that he and I are apparently very alike. He has said so repeatedly, and even his wife admits it. It is a case of us all being restless souls with impossible desires, I suppose." May O'Callaghan always had a very good turn of phrase. Another interesting point in this correspondence is when O'Callaghan encouraged Joseph Freeman, who had by now joined the US Communist Party, to get in touch with Liam's brother Tom, and to tell Tom how much these kids, this was her term for the Russian literary elite, want a visit from Liam. So they're dying for him to visit. So of course, Liam's book, I Went to Russia, does of course reveal that the kids eventually got their visit, though perhaps not the one they wanted. Second, more substantial review of O'Flaherty's work appeared in the 1928 edition of the journal On Literary Guard. It's authored by Eugene Fogarty. Eugene Fogarty is an individual who has come to the attention of Joycean scholars. Joycean scholars identify him as possibly an Irishman living in Moscow who corresponded with Joyce and was the first person to seriously introduce Russian readers to Joyce's works. But I can reveal that Eugene Fogarty is in fact May O'Callaghan's pseudonym. Under this assumed identity, O'Callaghan penned this personal account. She reflected on her visit to O'Flaherty in 1927, essentially, and she described their meeting, and particularly focusing on how they met in the wake of Kevin O'Higgins' assassination. And she also praised his work effusively and then kind of foreshadowed the assassin, which would in itself draw on the events surrounding Kevin O'Higgins' assassination. Here's just a quote I like from the review, which is the opening lines. "Liam O'Flaherty says of himself that he is the most unpopular man in Ireland. I think that in these words we find that well-known Irish tendency to exaggerate." Shortly after this letter was sent, it was shortly after this article was published in March of 1928, May O'Callaghan left Moscow. She was intending only a short visit away, but certain circumstances would transpire, which would mean that she would never again return to Russia. And these events were very much linked to Liam O'Flaherty. So this is a letter that May O'Callaghan writes to Ruth Kennel, a friend of hers who was a California feminist who moved to Russia, I believe, around 1922 to work in a Siberian commune. Ruth Kennel then moved to Moscow in 1926 and shared a flat with May O'Callaghan. They became very close friends. They initiated correspondence that goes all the way until May O'Callaghan dies in 1973. And in this 7th of August 1928 letter, May O'Callaghan writes, "Nellie, like a sweet, inexperienced person, has slipped and put her foot in it seriously. Result is that she thought it would be nice to go to Russia where children are not considered illegitimate. Have you got me? She had already talked of getting away from this country for a year or so, but now she must. Even the prospective father is ignorant of this affair, enough said." And I'm guessing that we're all here at the Liam O'Flaherty Festival, so you can all guess who the prospective father was. It seems that Nellie Cohen, on one of her visits between Moscow and London, bringing O'Flaherty's royalties, had left with more than she bargained for and had fallen pregnant with his second child. He already had, Pegeen was already born, his first daughter. And this letter is interesting, not just for this revelation. It's interesting because it's a really stark piece of evidence for why independent-minded, progressive women like Nellie Cohen or May O'Callaghan would look to the Soviet Union as a place where they could bring up their children. Firstly, you see it's here. Wouldn't it be nice to go to Russia where children are not considered illegitimate? The Soviet family code had abolished the category of illegitimacy. In the same years after the revolution, the Soviet Union became the first state to provide legal access to abortion. Later in this letter, May O'Callaghan talks about how initially she had wanted to bring Nellie to the Soviet Union to procure an abortion, but Nellie had then decided that she wanted to keep the child. This next piece is an interesting document that was sent to me by the Russian family involved in all of this. And it's a description of the night that Nellie's daughter was conceived. So she writes, Nellie's daughter was the result of a windswept romance in a hotel room with an Irish communist, a married man. They drank whiskey and sang Irish songs, and the result was Nellie's daughter. So, to bring you up to date then, May O'Callaghan and Nellie are attempting to get into Russia, where they'll raise this child free of the social mores of the conservative West. But they can't. They end up instead going to the United States. So you see here is a ship's manifest. May O'Callaghan, Nellie Cohen. May O'Callaghan's nationality is listed as Irish, but oddly enough, Nellie's, who was born and raised in England, her nationality is Hebrew. And May O'Callaghan writes also about this boat journey. An element of fear that she has that someone on the boat is going to discover Nellie's condition, so to speak, and she'll then be cast out as a fallen woman. So again, coming back to this idea that they would have been safer in terms of social conditioning in the Soviet Union. There's a particular reason why they couldn't go back to Moscow, and that was that May O'Callaghan, when she lived in Moscow, became really popular amongst this literary circle, which was very diverse in cultural opinion, political opinion. They included amongst her circle numerous people who sided with Trotsky in the legendary debates of the late 1920s between Trotsky's idea of world revolution, Stalin's idea of socialism in one country. Now, I think May O'Callaghan was herself relatively apolitical when it came to these debates. She was more interested in the Soviet Union as a site of cultural experimentation. But somehow, a rumour got out that when May O'Callaghan had first left Moscow in 1927, she had left with a number of Trotskyist funds. So she's tarred essentially with this identity. And it's the reason that she's refused a visa to return with Nellie in 1928. So they decide to go to the US, where May O'Callaghan has numerous political comrades and literary contacts. There's a picture of life in New York, really. On the left is May O'Callaghan with Liam O'Flaherty's daughter, who was born in February of 1929. Her name was Joyce. And this is Nellie, her mother, with Joyce, also in New York. Joyce must be around 2 or 3 in this photo. There's an interesting story about Joyce's name, which is that when Nellie arrived, Nellie and May arrived, they needed to find a means of working, of surviving. So May O'Callaghan's close friend was a woman named Jessica Granville Smith, who was a member who had traveled to the Soviet Union in the early 1920s as a part of a Quaker relief mission for famine distress, and then become a convinced communist. So they arrange for Nellie to babysit Jessica Granville Smith's son. And it's Jessica Granville Smith who suggests the name Joyce. And Jessica Granville Smith, her husband is a man named Harold Ware, who's alleged to have been the person who established the spy ring that eventually moved the secrets of the atom bomb from the US to the Soviet Union. So it was the wife of this man who named Liam O'Flaherty's second daughter. Which I think is just an interesting anecdote, but it gives you a sense of the world that they lived within when they moved to New York. May O'Callaghan sustained herself by working as partly as an expert on Soviet cultural affairs to significant figures. For example, Theodore Dreiser, Nobel Prize nominated novelist, many of you might have heard of him, and Alfred H. Barr, who founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. May O'Callaghan appears in Alfred H. Barr's diaries, in fact, and it was Theodore Dreiser who wrote her visa support letter when she wanted to stay on in New York. Here's another interesting document, which I found in MI5 police surveillance. It's a letter from Nellie Cohen to her sister, Rose Cohen. I've given you a family tree, which should keep you grounded as we get into the Cohen family now. So Nellie writes to her sister, Rose. I think it's a good idea for us to send our letters via Eve. Eve Reckitt is one of their friends. So they're aware that Rose's letters are being intercepted. And she writes here, and the agent writes here, has written to OF, O'Flaherty, sending him photo of Joyce. So this letter is dated 13th of March 1930. So we know that at least as early as 1930, Liam O'Flaherty was aware that he had this daughter in New York. What's also interesting about this letter is what the agent has noted above the name O'Flaherty, PF60318. That refers to personnel files, so it's a cross-reference. And this proves to us that MI5 had a file open on Liam O'Flaherty. I've asked the archive, and they've told me there's two options, one more likely than the other. One is that it simply hasn't been declassified yet, or two, and unfortunately the more likely option, there was just a huge basically bonfire of these kind of documents in 1945 when the Labour government came in, because MI5 had of course been keeping tabs on the entirety of the British left. So this personnel file on O'Flaherty may have gone up in smoke, but Rose Cohen's did survive, which is why we have this document. But that raises the question, why were MI5 keeping a tab on Nellie Cohen's sister? This is a picture of Rose Cohen. She's seen here on the right. Some figures that some of you might recognize. In the middle is Bob Stewart, a very famous British communist who spent a lot of time in Ireland in the 1920s helping to establish the Irish Communist Party. And on the left is Harry Pollitt, who was General Secretary of the British Communist Party for decades. Rose Cohen was an early member of the British Communist Party. She was very widely respected, very widely admired. In fact, this letter itself is from the personal papers of Harry Pollitt. And on the back of this letter, he had written, "This is a photograph of Rose Cohen, who has rejected me 14 times." So, Rose Cohen spent the 1920s on a number of missions for the Communist International, traveling across the world. She also met in England a man named David Petrovsky. David Petrovsky is a really fascinating figure. He was originally born in Ukraine, but he moved to America at quite a young age. And there he joined the Bund, which was the Jewish socialist organization. Because of his many years in America, he could speak, although he was Russian Empire national, he could speak English with a perfect American accent. So when he joined the Bolshevik Party and then became an agent operating abroad for the Communist International, he was ideal really because he could pass as someone who wasn't Russian. So they sent him as an overseer to the Communist parties in Britain and the US as well. And some of the people who knew him from this time thought that he was just a Yank from the East Coast. He was extremely successful, one of the most successful Comintern agents in terms of evading discovery. He was never positively identified. He operated under a number of pseudonyms. And everyone, all of his friends in the Communist network, would only refer to him as the Big Nose. So you even see it in May O'Callaghan's correspondence, he always says things like, "Rose has married the Big Nose." They always retain that code name. And in fact, he's so successful that I've been unable to find a picture of him. So Rose marries David Petrovsky in 1929, and they return to Moscow. And in December of 1929, the exact same year Joyce was born, they have a child, Alyosha Davidovich Petrovsky. So these are these two first cousins who are born in the same year of each other. In fact, Nellie returns to the UK around 1931, 1932, and it gives her a chance to meet her sister again and for these two cousins to meet. So on the left is Joyce, Liam O'Flaherty's daughter, her mother Nellie, This is Rose Cohen, who's on her first trip back from Moscow since she moved over to marry her husband, and Alyosha, her son. Now, interestingly, and we'll get into this story, it's quite detailed, and I don't know how much I'll be able to describe within the time frame we have, but this is the last time that these two first cousins will meet until the 1980s. The reason for this is really linked as much to the history of the Soviet Union in the 1930s as it is to anything else. Rose's next trip to England was in 1936. And the background to this trip is that, of course, we know of what occurred in the Soviet Union in the late 1930s with the mass operations and the waves of arrests. And David Petrovsky, Rose's husband, was very high-ranking and began to feel the ranks closing in on him. So he arranged to try and get a visa. He was a sort of military tactician. He headed military colleges. So he said, I want to study military colleges in the West with my wife and child. He's granted this visa. Rose prepares to leave. Alyosha prepares to leave. At the last minute, Petrovsky's visa is revoked, and they say that your son can't leave with you. He's a Soviet citizen, but Rose is still a British citizen, so she can go as she pleases. So Nellie met her at this time and didn't know the full story why, but described her sister as very distracted and very upset. 1930, and Rose returns to the Soviet Union, and in March of 1937, David Petrovsky is arrested. He's interrogated for several months, and in September, he is executed. Rose wanted to keep her son away from the tumult of what was happening, so she placed her son Alyosha in a summer camp for the entirety of the summer. Unfortunately, before the summer camp could end, Rose herself was arrested on August 15th. She was interrogated for a number of months, and she was executed on the 28th of November 1937. On the right is Sergei Sergeyevich Dynamov, Nemo Flaherty's editor in the Soviet Union, who also suffered a similar fate, executed on the 16th of April 1939. Both, of course, posthumously rehabilitated, along with David Petrovsky. So, and this in some ways goes in part to explain why, when we look at the dates of O'Flaherty's publications in Russia, they're all clustered around a series of years. Chiefly, it's the fact that May O'Callaghan is in Russia at this point, and she's arranging for these things. But also, the publications just don't exist after the 1930s because O'Flaherty's living link to Russia is essentially gone. With Sergei Dynamov gone, Rose Cohen gone, this sort of family link disappears. There's also, I won't bore you with the sort of Soviet cultural politics, which also feeds into it, but that is a context. But what of Liam O'Flaherty's daughter growing up in London? Nellie, her mother, married Hugo Rathbone, was sort of a leading intellectual in the British Communist Party. In around 1934, Joyce adopts his name, which is why if some of you have known Joyce, you would have known her as Joyce Rathbone. May O'Callaghan writes a letter updating Ruth on Joyce's progress. He says, she is now, and already for some time, music mad. I've known of people being very talented, but I've never come across anyone like her. The thing seems to upset her so that she is sometimes hardly normal. Of course, she is a very highly strung mortal, and to say the least, rather difficult. She's decided to specialise in music, and I must say I hate the thought of it. If the world does not change very considerably, it may mean she will become a drudge. I mean, she may have to teach music. Joyce became a music teacher, and that was her career. But by all accounts of people who I know who have met her, she was anything but a drudge. Spoke with this very plummy English accent, and was always politically on the left. One anecdote that her goddaughter told me was that once there was a census going around. Joyce was a diligent daily reader of the Morning Star, which was the British Communist Party's paper. The census collector comes to her door and knocks on the door, and she's filling out the questions, and he asks her, and so what's your newspaper of choice? And she says, well, the Morning Star, of course. And he says, oh, we don't have that. How about the Daily Mail? And she sent him away. Absolutely not. Joyce grew up really without learning of without knowing who her real father was. And we were talking earlier, Martine, about how Joyce became suspicious of Liam O'Flaherty. And there's several stories. One which her goddaughter told me was that her mother Nellie would keep the bookshelves horrifically dusty, but she'd always dust the collected works of Liam O'Flaherty. So she became suspicious. But of course, as we were talking earlier as well, if she had pulled these works of Liam O'Flaherty off the shelf, which I have done because they still exist on Joyce's goddaughter's shelf, she would see inscriptions to May O'Callaghan from Liam O'Flaherty, you know. So she could have made the links, right? Liam O'Flaherty was someone who was in my mother and her best friend's life at the time I was born, so maybe he's my father. So in 1957, she set about getting in touch with him. She started drafting letters to write to him. Here's one that she writes, I found in her papers, so obviously it was unsent. She writes, Dear Liam O'Flaherty, I've been wanting to get in touch with you for a long time, but I've never been able to decide how to do so. I've begun and torn up several letters because what I want to say sounds absurdly dramatic, no matter how I word it. The only way seems to be a bold statement of fact, that you are my father, that I was born in February 1929, and that my mother's name, when you knew her, was Nellie Cohen. Liam O'Flaherty did eventually establish contact with the daughter whose existence he had known about at least as early as 1930. Joyce's Russian family have told me that it was Kitty, O'Flaherty's partner, who instigated the meeting. Kitty was managing O'Flaherty's affairs and began to notice these letters coming in from the daughter. So O'Flaherty was ignoring them. She was going through, you can see from the letters that she's going through a few avenues. She's also trying to contact him through his publisher, through editors, but eventually Kitty approaches Liam and says, you know, you need to get in touch with this daughter of yours. So you can precisely date the first meeting because it happens in 1960. Joyce, who's pictured here, around the age of sort of 27, 28, was the piano accompaniment for an Irish violinist by the name of Hugh Maguire. And in February of 1960, she came to give a concert in the RDS. And it was after this concert that she met her father for the first time. What I find interesting is that she seems to have developed an attachment to her father almost immediately. By August of that year, she was writing a letter to Liam in which she said, I felt so sad leaving you this morning. It must have been quite apparent. You were really wonderful to me. The thought that someone else might have been my father is quite terrible. It's interesting, I think, considering he... Joyce thus also came to know her wider Irish family. She discovered that she had a half-sister living in London, Pegeen, and the two became friends. May O'Callaghan recounted Joyce's newfound family in a 1961 letter to Ruth Kennel, the California feminist with whom she had shared the first news of Nellie's pregnancy back in 1928. O'Callaghan wrote that Joyce has met Liam O'Flaherty and likes him very much, and he proudly introduces her as my daughter. But the nicest thing is that she has found her half-sister who lives quite near. She's seemingly a Russian linguist anyhow and conducts Russian students who visit this country. They are great pals. Liam lives in Dublin and Joyce met him when doing concerts there last year. I expect this will amuse you. Nellie doesn't mind and quite likes Pegeen. It's a funny world, isn't it? So I think it is actually quite curious that Pegeen, who had this deep interest in Russian culture and is herself Russian Orthodox, discovered in the 1960s that she had this half-sister who had her own family in Russia. This is a letter, this is a picture of the two daughters and O'Flaherty. So O'Flaherty, Pegeen in the middle, and Joyce on the right. Now, interestingly, when I came to the festival back in 2015, the keynote speaker was Seamus Cashman. And he sent Joyce the invite to this event. So somewhere out of frame, he's in this room too. So it just goes to show just how live all of this history is. So in 1984, when Liam O'Flaherty passed away, Joyce attended this funeral and she wrote this quite kind of moving but also funny letter about attending his funeral. She wrote about how the social atmosphere of the Irish funeral really suited her, but that she was really aghast when she approached the priest afterwards and he informed her that his job was all show business. So, it was also a tough time for Joyce in the sense that Kitty, Liam O'Flaherty's partner, was also hospitalised at this time also, and she had just only a few years earlier lost her mother Nellie. But you can tell from the letters of condolences that come into Joyce and the way she writes about it, she had really, by this point, completely identified herself as an O'Flaherty. So this family that she discovers only in the 1950s, in her late 20s, really becomes a part of her identity. But of course, she also remained acutely aware that she was also a Cohen. And in 1981, when her mother died, she began leafing through her mother's documents and found these yellowed photographs of the aunt and cousin that she had met all the way back in 1932. And she became interested in the idea of getting in touch with and finding out if her cousin was still alive and if she could meet him. There's some conflicting kind of interpretations and stories in family memory of how this goes about. Some, the Russian family claim that Joyce informed them that growing up she had always been told that Rose and Alyosha had died of pneumonia during the Second World War. But of course, Joyce lived in that area around Hampstead Heath, which was sort of like its own little communist enclave of aged communists. So she went to people like it's Arthur Rothstein. He was one of the first members. His father was Theodore Rothstein, who was Lenin's man in London. And she approached him with a name for a cousin and said, "Can you try and find out how I'm going to find this cousin?" And he actually finds his address. So this person is, and then this letter here is quite an astounding addressee to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I'm very interested in establishing contact with my cousin, a Soviet citizen, whom I have not seen since we were both small children. The interesting thing about this letter is how Joyce frames this. She stresses her trade union links. She stresses the fact that her mother was a member of the British Communist Party, and she stresses the fact that there's no question of my being motivated by anti-Soviet sentiments or of my wishing to make propaganda against the Soviet government, past or present. When these letters arrive to Alyosha in Moscow, his family told me that the first thing he did was believe that this was an agent provocateur, and he brought these letters to his superiors and said, I wipe my hands of this. I'm obviously being contacted from Britain. And apparently the bosses were sympathetic. They said, well, what if this is your cousin? You should get in touch with her. So he did. And this is Joyce in Moscow around 1982. She is here. This is Alyosha's son, Mikhail, who's someone I'm in touch with as well. And you can see I like this photo because she's showing him a photograph. And there's a sort of symbolism to this, which is that when Alyosha was orphaned at the age of 7, he had lived these 7 years in the communist elite, this child of the communist elite, and suddenly he was sent into this network of orphanages. He didn't even remember his precise birth date, and he had very, very few mementos or photos of his parents. So it was really when Joyce visited in 1982 that he was able to rediscover and see these photos. And one of these photos that Joyce brought over is actually emplaced in Alyosha's gravestone in Moscow. To bring my talk to an end, I want to return to the figure who really is sort of the centre of the story and who sets all of these events in motion, May O'Callaghan. Pictured here is her personal copy of Liam O'Flaherty's book, I Went to Russia. It's inscribed to her, to OC with love and good wishes from Nellie and Joyce as an advance birthday present. Through her liaisons between O'Flaherty and Soviet publishing houses, it was O'Callaghan who first really planted the seeds of this visit in the mind of O'Flaherty and Soviet officialdom. This personal copy of I Went to Russia is a fitting synthesis of the events and individuals I've described today. Through these kind of revolutions, both personal and political, these figures were a constant really in each other's lives. May, Nellie, Joyce, even Rose, a tragic family memory, and O'Flaherty, a never forgotten romance and an absent for some years father. What I like about this hidden part of Liam O'Flaherty's biography is I think it really gives us an insight into the the era that produced O'Flaherty's works and the ideals and the emotions of that era. So I want to bring you to close in part with this quote from May O'Callaghan's close friend, whose memoir allowed me to discover her, the once celebrated Marxist literary critic Joseph Freeman, who incidentally once visited the baby Joyce in New York, and he was there with his friend Roger Baldwin, who founded the American Civil Liberties Union. So they both peered together into the cot to look at Joyce. Later in life, in 1965, he wrote about his time in Moscow and that particular generation. He said, "It was an era that was romantic, utopian, and everywhere profoundly humanist, and moved by the basic dream with the changing name, the ever-recurring vision of the universal liberation and redemption of mankind. It is only when we encounter this era in its own terms, as the living experience of a generation, that it regains its meaning. To encounter it in its own terms, we need to cross the years and the sea of blood that separates us from it, and to surmount the traumas of our own time." The story of Niamh O'Flaherty, May O'Callaghan and the Cohens, Rose, Nellie and Joyce, provides, I hope, a keyhole view into the idealism of the time. In May of 1973, May O'Callaghan died at the age of 92. Her funeral was attended by only two people, Nellie and Joyce. Shortly after she was laid to rest, Nellie received a letter from May's former Moscow flatmate, Ruth Kennel, who wrote, "You were her dearest friend. I soon learned when I first met O.C. in Moscow, Joyce later was also precious to her. Your lives together make a beautiful story of mutual devotion." I've little to add to this apt conclusion, except to underline that to really do justice to these forgotten women who brought Niamh O'Flaherty to Soviet Russia and shaped his engagement with that revolution in ways that have hitherto remained unknown, we should restore these women to their proper place as important individuals in the life of one of Ireland's literary greats, but also valuable and fascinating historical figures in their own right. Thank you.
Amazing, I think, is the word. Is it not? Amazing. And if our society did nothing else but get a young academic writer working on that, it would, now, brilliant. You will make pardon me for not remembering that you won our arena prize